Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming here to USIP today. I'm Jon Temin. I'm the director of the Sudan and South Sudan program here at the Institute. My first order of business is to ask you to please turn off your cell phones. Let me also welcome the people who are watching us via our webcast online. We thank you very much for watching. We have a special opportunity today to hear from the special representative of the Secretary General, Hilde Johnson, who of course leads United Nations efforts in South Sudan. This is, of course, one of the newest peacekeeping missions in the world, UNMISS, with over 7,000 uniformed personnel and a budget of about $876 million. They are working in a very challenging environment in South Sudan, as many in our audience, I'm sure, are well aware. There are some rising concerns about human rights issues, about individual freedoms, about commitment to good governance, about relations with Sudan in the north. And we'll get to all that probably in our discussion today, but our focus, at least initially, is going to be on some of the concerns surrounding stability and insecurity in South Sudan. That, of course, has been in the news recently, particularly in Jonglei State, also in Wau, also in a few other places. So the SRSG is going to focus her remarks, at least initially now, on protection of civilian issues, which are, of course, central to UNMISS's mandate, and I know are a great priority for them. So she will speak initially and has a presentation to accompany those remarks, and then we're going to move to a discussion into a question and answer session with the audience and with those online as well, and we should have plenty of time for that, and wrapping up around 11:30 or so. So let me thank you again very much for coming, and it's my pleasure to introduce the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Hilde Johnson.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I wonder whether we should, when I get started on this, we should dim the lights a little bit so it's easier to see, but I leave that to the organizers. Thank you for that introduction. And before just going straight into the protection of civilians issues, just a few words about the context within which we are operating in South Sudan. For those who are standing behind, there are seats in front, so feel free to come. South Sudan has been through a very difficult 18 months after independence, a very challenging environment where we have seen virtually all the energy be sucked into South Sudan issues. They got the divorce before the divorce papers were ready. And hence we are in a situation where, as in divorce situations, the tensions continue and become very difficult to manage. And so what we're seeing is that core state building and nation building functions get much less attention because all the energy is sucked in. That has a big impact on the mandate and a big impact on the ability of the government to really take the country forward. So in a way, at the moment, it's a little hostage to these external factors. And it also impedes on the protection of civilians' agenda as well. So I wanted to make that point initially, that the mandate the mission has, which is a strong state-building mandate, beyond the protection of civilians, actually also is impacted by this, and where progress is slow when we have a situation where the tensions are still ongoing and where higher priorities for the government basically is the fundamental issues around the secession, around establishing the sovereignty of the nation, etc. That has to be the backdrop of this presentation. Let me take you through a few slides. This is the threats that we see in South Sudan. As you can see on the yellows along the border, these are areas where there is still tension and where there still is, to some extent, build-up. This does not fall explicitly within the mandate of the mission. It's the JBVMM that is supposed to be established, the Border Monitoring and Verification Mission, that is supposed to monitor the border. Nevertheless, it impacts on the POC issues. And you see a number of hotspots in South Sudan, many of them in Jonglei, but also elsewhere. In the tri-state area between Warab, Unity, and Lake State, those are the two really, really big ones. But as you can see, the flashpoints are virtually in all states of the country. And they're very often in extremely remote and inaccessible areas. this is impacting on the mission's ability to protect civilians. The fact that we have a pattern like that of POC threats or security challenges implies that the mission has to be decentralized. There's no way it can operate in its mandate without having presence in all 10 states. What we are also now present at the county level at 13 locations, but we will increase towards a quite big number of locations. We're in the pipeline of building those sites, but we really need to be present in a very decentralized manner. And the reason also is community engagement is essential to prevent these situations from getting out of hand. To be able to engage with communities, you need to be present at the local level, you need to build trust, and you need to be in a position to prevent these hotspots from erupting into major incidences of violence. Let us move to the different missions that we see in the UN at this point in time that are relevant to us. MONUSCO, UNMISS, UNMISS, and the mission in Côte d'Ivoire are comparable to the mission in South Sudan. We have a mandate which is advise and assist, but we do not have joint operations, as you can see with the SPLA. This is different from MONUSCO. As you know, MONUSCO has a strong mandate, and they're also in alignment with FARDC in fighting M23 in the Kivus. And they have a more specific cooperative mandate in that respect. While UNMISS is present almost all over South Sudan to cater for these challenges, the main operations of MONUSCO are in northeast Congo, as we know. It's also different from UNAMID because UNAMID does not have a mandate to directly support the host government in protection of civilians for obvious reasons of historical character. I think we all know those. And it doesn't have a capacity building role. This is also different from UNMISS, where we actually are supposed to try to assist the government, the host government's ability to protect its own civilians, its own citizens. And this is a critical difference between the different peacekeeping mandates. Our protection of civilians activities will be undertaken on the 3 peacekeeping principles, which is consent of the parties, impartiality, and non-use of force except in self-defense. So those are the parameters within which we operate. Let me move to the POC strategy, which we have developed in UNMISS, our protection of civilian strategy. This has 3 tiers. The first tier is the political one, is to prevent things from happening. You know, that's a successful POC strategy, is if you prevent things from happening, you know, we can avoid using force. So we are very strongly and actively engaged in a number of peace efforts in the country. The most critical one, of course, has been the Jonglei peace process, given the criticality of the developments there. We are, just as an example, we have, I think, done 3,000 flights in the first 12 months of the year, only to Jonglei and within Jonglei, in support of peace processes, deterrence, hierarchies, and also deployments. The second tier, which is the main focus of today's presentation, is the physical protection. We had a significant effort, and I'll get back to that, trying to protect civilians when there was a major attack on Pibo, in Jonglei by Laonur, columns of 6,000 to 8,000. And we also, in that respect, lobbied very early the government to protect its own civilians through deploying forces. And that collaboration actually did assist in defending Pibo and preventing not only hundreds, but since we don't have firm numbers, I think thousands of deaths of civilians. The third area of protection of civilians is critical, and that's the protective environment for each and every citizen. This goes both with regard to the police, their opportunity to provide security and the rule of law for the people, promotion and protection of human rights, and of course the humanitarian aspect with the protection cluster. We're working very actively, and the POC strategy of the mission has gone through all the consultations with the UN country team, with the protection cluster, and it's a full consensus document across the whole UN family. The latter third tier will not be the focus of this presentation. It will be mainly the second tier, which is on physical protection. And it's not because it's not important, it's where I want some of the challenges to be left with you. Let us move to the field realities of protection of civilians. We have instructed our teams around the country in all 10 states to do an analysis of what are the critical protection of civilians challenges in your state and develop an action plan and an operational plan to address them. So every state office in the mission in all 10 states now are developing their own operational plans. Every base also has a contingency plan for how to protect civilians on their location. So that goes down to the county level. We have almost finished our training of staff on the POC strategy so that they can operationalize this in a much better way. We have also been the only and first mission so far that explicitly has early warning in our mandate. This is very critical for protection of civilians. As we all know, if there is early warning, early action, maybe we can just do the first tier, which is the political response, and the whole use of physical protection can be avoided. So we are using our early warning mechanisms. Firstly, we have developed an early warning strategy and a mechanism. We have weekly early warning meetings with all counterparts, both OCHA, UNDP, DSS. They provide early warning advice to us as a mission on which actions to take this week to try to prevent things from unraveling. South Sudan is part of the support that IGAD provides to their, IGAD is the Horn of Africa organization, to their early warning and response mechanism, which is called SIR1, and they are focusing on cross-border threats and crises, so that's in the region, and that goes across the borders of different IGAD countries. On our side, we are also trying to support the government in strengthening their early warning system. It's still quite weak, but we are developing support to their state security committees and to dedicated capacity also at the county level. Then let me move to the protection of civilians strategies we are facing in implementing this strategy, because strategies are nice on paper, but it is when they're going to be implemented that we're faced with the realities of this world. And let me go through some of those challenges for you. And that is where we find ourselves sometimes in a very challenging environment. Firstly, the primary responsibility for protection of civilians will always rest with the government. It will always rest with the SPLA and with the police. And we cannot replace that at all, nor do we have the capacity to do so with our force. And I'll return to that a little bit later. So the issue is, when do we shift from prevention, which is the early warning engagement, calling on the government to take action, and to us to mobilize our forces and act? That is always a careful assessment. When do we rely on the government to take their responsibility? And then when do we jump in and say, hey, this is not adequately addressed, we need to move in with our forces? This is linked to the early warning, early response mechanisms. And it's a very case-by-case assessment that has to be made. And the shift when we have contingency plans to move in and then take action, that is a challenge. And it's a balancing act between government responsibility and the mission. And only very, very close cooperation and discussions with the government will give us the necessary advice to know exactly when do we start acting with our physical protection, with our forces. The second challenge, again, the primary protection actor is, as I said, the SPLA, the government's own armed forces. However, one of the biggest challenges we're facing in some areas of South Sudan is when state security forces themselves are not protecting civilians, but in some cases actually are violating and attacking civilians. We are in a situation in Jonglei where the Murle population are at loggerheads with the SPLA, and where we are likely to find tension as we now see developments and preparedness for a major military operation against David Yao Yao, one of the militias in Jonglei, and where it is very difficult to avoid situations where civilians get into the squeeze. Clearly, that is a challenge for the mission. We are set here to support the protection mandate, to implement our protection mandate and support the host government's ability to protect civilians. So one of the most important things we're doing at this point in time is to discuss with the government how they can implement the Geneva Conventions, distinguish between civilians and combatants, distinguish between non-combatants and combatants, and how they can try to avoid that civilians can become hit by their military operations against this militia. A big challenge. The third challenge, which I really want to highlight, and this is partly also going to be justified or further elaborated in this presentation, is managing expectations of the population. Clearly, what we're seeing in South Sudan is a population that is not always well informed, that protection of civilians or by the UN does not necessarily mean and does not mean protection of the sovereignty of South Sudan or protection of the territory of South Sudan. So the assumption, both among civilians as well as among many politicians in South Sudan, is that the mission is here to protect South Sudan against aggression of Sudan. I'm assuming this is Chatham House rules. You didn't say that in the beginning. But
no, I wouldn't assume that. We do have a webcast audience.
Yeah. So the perception, the perception basically is, among South Sudanese actors, is that you're here to protect us against whatever aggressor. And of course, in the border clashes period, it was seen that we were failing to protect South Sudan in that setting. So we are in a situation where that perception was prominent, and where we had to do a lot of communication, messaging to government officials as well as to the population, that actually that is not our mandate. Our mandate is to protect civilians. It's not to protect the territory. It's not to protect the sovereignty of the nation. And we have then explained to everybody that there is supposed to be a border monitoring verification mission coming. This is not the mandate of UNMISS. And that was a very critical period, but it still is. The minute we get any allegations of attacks across the border, these perceptions start coming up again. The second issue of perception, of course, is the resources we have to be able to protect civilians against the threats civilians are faced with. Clearly, with our numbers, we are outnumbered in many of these situations, and we face logistical difficulties. And I'll revert to that a little bit later. The third very important expectation management issue is cattle raids. In South Sudan, a number of threats against civilians are related to violent cycles of violence that get out of hand, and where we are seeing, for example, the levels of attack reaching numbers like 100 or several hundred. The civilian population will then accuse UNMISS of not being there. Now, the challenge of cattle raids that come at night very speedily with lethal weapons, but they're not possible to detect even with the best early warning mechanisms, we cannot deploy with the challenges we have in South Sudan on time to be able to protect civilians. And hence the accusation comes, why were you not there to protect us, you protect the others, etc., etc. Finally, the fourth challenge is how to measure success. Actually, the most successful protection of civilians action is prevention. And it means that if nothing happens, we have succeeded. But telling the story that we actually helped prevent something from happening and telling people that that was a big success, they will not understand, right? So it looks as if what we're succeeding in doing is not counted as success. That's totally invisible. But what we face with as challenges in our ability to protect civilians becomes the story of the mission, right? So it's one of those very difficult challenges. And I'll revert to one of those incidences a little bit later, where there was a big success, but nobody actually knows about it. Let me move to physical protection. Here you see the mission. We have a troop ceiling of 7,000, but those who are actually able to defend and protect civilians are not as many, 4,009. In a territory as big as France, it is not a big force, to put it mildly. So the main responsible actor to protect civilians will always be the government with its security forces. Let me move to one of the incidents then that I mentioned where we managed to protect a number of civilians. This is in Jonglei State in Peacekeeping County. You can see on the right column the total infantry that you saw at that time. This was in December 2011 over to January 2012. Our infantry was 3,500. You can see how many attackers that our forces were faced with. And we didn't have 3,500. That's in the whole of the country. That's in the whole of South Sudan in all 10 states. We're faced with a column of Laonur that were moving towards Peacekeeping Town around 8,000. Now, any military or anyone with a military background knows that if you're going to be able to protect civilians against a force of 8,000, you need 16,000. If it's fully, equipped. Okay, so let's say they were not all fully equipped, although almost everybody had AK-47s, they had RPGs, they had lots of weapons, very advanced and new ones. Let's deduct a little bit, let's say 12,000. But we had 3,500 in the whole of the country, right? And in Peacekeeping Town, of course, we had more than half of our forces committed to that operation. But it would never even remotely be able to defend civilians. So we are in a situation where this cycle of violence had gone on all along from 2009 up to this moment. We saw this column developing over weeks. We gave early warning to the government. We saw it build up from 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 to 8,000 as it was moving towards the town. We saw it was moving towards 3 locations. In the end, it moved towards 1 location. We moved our forces to that location. A total of 15 companies, around 8 were committed to the operation, more than half. Still, because of the rotation procedures in the military, you can only have 4 companies on the ground because you need to have half of the committed force there, and then you need to rotate in. So you only have 4 companies. So we had, through the early warning, made sure that the government at least deployed additional forces. And it was with the use of lethal force against the column that it turned around. The SPLA fired first. We had APCs there ready to fire. But when the SPLA fired against their own people, against the column, and quite a number were killed, they turned. With them turning around, thousands of people were saved. They would most likely have killed a very, very large number. So these are among the challenges that we have. At the same time, it's important to say that we didn't have military helicopters at the time because they were grounded. The Russians had pulled them out. And so we transported our APCs through the mud for 2 days, 3 days drive from Bo to Peacekeeping, and we managed just to arrive on time. It was at 10 o'clock, and in the morning the attack happened. So these are among the logistical challenges I'll revert to in a minute, and how we are trying to implement our mandate. Throughout this process, we did reconciliation efforts. We tried to prevent this whole thing from happening with supporting the peace process. In the end, it didn't succeed. This was mainly done by church leaders, and the column attacked. But again, we were overwhelmed, but because of the lethal force used by the SPLA, combined with our presence, the attack was averted. But still, through other parts of the column, 612 people were killed still. Thousands were saved. Next slide. So why is this so difficult? I told you about the APCs that were driving through the mud. It's very important to know that South Sudan, through the rainy season, which lasts usually 8 months of the year, in Peacekeeping County, almost 9, you see the country, 65% of it is cut off during that period. No roads, not a possibility to move. It's vast swamps, it's floods. And you see that 46 out of 79 counties, as you see on the left column, are affected by floods during that period. And it makes protection of civilians extremely difficult. And you're totally reliant on air. Let me show you a couple of pictures. So this is not a rainy day. This is 8 months of the year. right? So it's not after a big, shower. This is how it is, permanently, during 8 months of the year. So major logistical hurdles. So the roads are therefore closed, right? Because you can't drive far in that type of mud. It's black cotton soil, for those who don't know the term. It's one of the most difficult types of soil to drive in and to work in. Maps on the left slide shows the road distances between major populated areas and hotspots in South Sudan. So you will see that there is no access during the rains. Bor Pibor is absolutely closed. It's just now opened 2 months into the dry season. Very, very difficult. You'll see the Yida Bentiu road, which is critical for humanitarian operations, but also for protection of civilians. Again, no access during the rains. And you can see how difficult it is to move, even when it is dry. 4 hours from Bentiu on a good day in a car. Trucks with supplies take days. The Gumuruk and Bor Pibor Road, 2 days to drive, 2 days to unload, and 2 days to return. So a week for one rotation. A week for one rotation. For example, of troops. We have huge challenges of logistics. And if you look to the right side, one of the things we're proposing to the Security Council and to the ACABQ, the Budget Committee in the UN now, is to be able to use the rivers. The rivers are the highways in South Sudan, and they're the highways during the rainy season and much of the dry season in many areas. So we can access, if we get more boats and get boats, we can access through the river between Renk and Malakal, which is a long, long distance. And we can also do this from Bo to the northern, southern, and northern states. So this will allow us to access populations in areas we're not able to reach at this point in time. And many of them are conflict prone, and we'll be able to do more on protection of civilians. So we'll see how that proposal goes. Hence, with all this and the lack of, you see where we're asking for the riverine unit to be established in all these different locations. Not many, 12 boats only, but it is essential. And maybe a little note for more humoristic purposes. In the Upper Nile, in the Malakal area, there was a riverine unit in former UNMISS 1S, but the way the riverine unit worked, it was just going a few hours one way and that way, and it just didn't serve the purpose of protection of civilians, so at least not much. So the criticality is to get a system which really fits with the South Sudanese conditions. Let us move to air. So we are reliant on helicopters. Because of lack of engineering capacity, a fixed wing is only in a few locations. And this means that helicopters is the main tool. This is a country that is as big as Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi together. Okay? So it's very, very huge. Vast territories, flight times very long. And as I mentioned, rotations have to happen frequently. In one long-distance patrol, you have to involve 2 helicopter flights, one for 18 troops, 18 only, the capacity, and one for 2.5 tons of equipment. If you're going to have more than 18 soldiers, you need to run 4 flights, 6 flights, 10 flights, etc. Yeah? And you have to fly 4 hours, 3.5, and you can calculate the logistical challenge this is. Air takes up 40% of our budget. Let's move to the next slide. This is how we operate. Again, this is not on a rainy day. This is on a normal day, 8 months of the year. And we need heli landing sites that can carry this situation. Very, very difficult. And this is in 65% of the country. So we get to our realities. I'm trying to talk about rhetoric and reality. So protection of civilians, as I have gone through for you, some of the main constraints on mobility. The military helicopters, now we have 3 Rwandese helicopters. We're waiting for the next 3. the riverine capability we're asking for. But as you can see, we have a huge part of the country cut off. On the troop side, we have very limited infantry troops, and the resupply needs, when you're reliant on helicopters, is really a huge burden, and the rotation issues. So let me just give you a little bit of information about what that means. So this means on impact. We had a situation in Pibor County where we were deployed in Lekongole and Pibor, 2 locations. Then more civilians moved into Gumurok and were under threat. We could not move troops into Gumurok and have the 2 other locations resupplied. It was not possible. It was only a company plus. The reason? Logistical hurdles, resupplying them, sustaining them over a stretch of time. So we had to pull up the troops in one location. By the way, this was after the Russian helicopter was shot down in Lekongole, and then move into the next location. So if we also then have a big Jonglei crisis under development and something else happens in the tri-state area, we cannot respond at 2 major crises at the same time. It's not possible with the infantry we have. So both 2 places, when there's a rainy season, extremely difficult, and when we have 2 major crises, extremely hard. So we will need to prioritize between civilians. Which civilians are under most threat, and where is the crisis most severe? And this is something we are in a very challenging environment to do, because we need to assess through early warning so that that decision is made early. Because we cannot protect, as I repeatedly say to my South Sudanese friends, we cannot protect civilians everywhere all the time. It is not possible. And our limited capacity and the constraints I just went through shows the challenges that we're in, and we have to make very difficult choices. This is the military patrols from the very outset, the beginning of the mission. We did 93 different patrols. This is both dynamic air patrols. This is 1-day max. Long duration patrols, which all of this is prevention, by the way, visibility, trying to be on the spot ahead of time, early warning, and in some cases also protection of civilians through physical presence. The long duration ones are up to 10 days. The short duration ones is 1 day. And the air recce's are critical for us to gather information. You can see how we have increased the patrol range from 93 in the first period of the mission and last at 1,100. So we're out there all the time doing all of this work, showing presence. We have been able to show presence evenly across Jonglei, in particular, as you can see where this map is, what this map is reflecting. This covers both Tinka areas, Luanor areas, and Murle areas. And at times, the situation may demand a greater focus of forces into one. We're now responding to the current threat of a retaliation attack from Wolgak and Laonurs into this area. So we're now positioning forces in both locations, both in the Laonur areas, reinforcing significantly, and in the locations you've seen on the right side, which is the Murle locations. And we're doing that in anticipation of the military operation by the SPLA. We are surging, therefore, troops when we see they're coming, but we are in Bo with the biggest numbers to make sure that we are prepared and can move in wherever the threat is the greatest, since we can't be everywhere all the time. Next, what we have been doing quite a lot is to protect civilians in our bases. We have experienced in Pibor town 5 times since October 2012 that civilians have sought refuge in our base. It's a pretty small one, yet we have had 5,000 there several times. Just this week, 2,000 sought refuge in our base. This was actually when the American ambassador was in Pibor visiting and talking to the county commissioner. The fighting started and we had to move her in, and a lot of civilians came at the same time. Sometimes they remained for a week, other times just a couple of days. Fortunately, this last incident went over very quickly, so after the civilians came in, they moved very quickly out again. So that was just a few hours. But it's a huge challenge for us. But we are receiving civilians deliberately in our camps, and we now have guidance being issued to all our locations so that they can feel safe with us. The same happened in Wau. Wau was the one most seen as the most peaceful place in South Sudan. Sudan. Yet also there, violence erupted in December, very serious. Unfortunately, and here we had 5,000 in our camp for 4 days. It's actually more than 19 to 20 December. It was a longer stretch of time. It was 4 days. So this is a major challenge that we are dealing with, but it's important for us to provide that protection. Sometimes the facilities get totally destroyed by the numbers, but still the door is still open. We are moving now at this point in time beyond the Jonglei preparation that I mentioned in anticipation of what's happening with the military operation. We're also moving very actively into the tri-state area, which is very volatile. And here we have what we call Operation Ankartite, which is across the 3-state area. And they're operating as we speak for 10 days to try to show presence, to try to show visibility, and to deter additional attacks. They've been very violent. And let me move then, related to that, to the next, which is the tri-state area. You see the 3 states here. You see the different locations. Our patrols are going into all those locations, the blue ones. And Operation Ankartite is set to prevent a conflict from violence from erupting further. Let me mention then the success story that nobody knows about. There was an attack under preparation with an assembly of 6,000 to 7,000, reportedly, Laonur youth that was moving in to attack the Dinka area from Twitch East into the Dinka areas in the shadow there. Through the engagement of the county commissioner, through the community chiefs and leaders, and through support from UNMISS, the Laonur column was convinced to return. It went back home, but it was ready to attack. Of course, if we'd had another 6,000-7,000 attack on the community, it would have had devastating consequences. It was averted through engagement. So that is an important part of our work. It is to be present. We have done similar movements into hotspot areas in the first 16 months of the mission. We've done 40 needs assessment and hotspot missions into different areas to try to prevent things from unraveling and to try to make sure that we provide early warning to the government and can act if necessary. Let me move to the last slides. This is the 5,000 in Wao camp. As you can see, a big number. Next one, please. Here you see the guys, our peacekeepers, helping the elderly and the vulnerable, the women and children. The left is in Wao, the right is in Pibo town. We don't have the opportunity to provide much food, and this is the humanitarian actors' field, but water they get and protection they are receiving. So this is part of our implementation of the POC mandate of the mission. That ends my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very comprehensive presentation. I want to ask a few follow-up questions, and then we're going to go to some questions from the audience. You made a point of emphasizing that the primary responsibility for protection of civilians falls with the government of South Sudan. But I want to ask how committed you see them being to that, because there are some reasons to raise some questions about that. If they are committed to it, at least politically, what do they need to prioritize in order to be better at it? Because I think they certainly could be better at it.
We've seen, I think, an increased commitment. At the outset, the SPLA has never been happy with doing what they see as policing work. I mean, they say in a division of labor in security institutions, it's normally police that does, internal security protection of civilians, whilst the army does the protection of territory and sovereignty of the nation. And of course, in South Sudan, the police capacity is limited. They have very few auxiliary police. We are trying to do something with that. The United States government is also invested in that. And we're training a lot of auxiliary police at the moment from the mission side. But still, I mean, they now have 7,000, but it's still not enough for these types of situations. And so that's a very important thing to do, is to prioritize auxiliary police and make sure they have a very robust and good force and service in that respect. But pending that development, the SPLA has to step in. There has been an increased acknowledgement that they have to do that lately. We've seen more willingness to engage, but it very often is a little too slow when we provide early warning, and very often not enough people. And so there is, from our side, now an attempt at looking at how we can develop the capacity and understanding of protection of civilians, of a protection of civilians mandate. And so this is one of the things that we are discussing with them at the moment, and we'll discuss also with council members. Now, the willingness to do that is a matter of a case-to-case, I think, assessment. And we are engaging very actively to make sure that, and try to make sure that there is willingness, political willingness to engage. We've seen in 2 occasions lately that the government is being more active in taking its responsibilities in relation to the WOW crisis and in relation to the last events in late January in Pibo. We saw a very, very strong government delegation come in, trying to avert the situation, address it. But that was much more on the prevention side than on the active protection, physical protection side. So the only alternative for us as a mission is to try to mobilize the government to take this responsibility seriously, and to do it with respect for core principles of both human rights standards, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, etc. And that's the only option, because as you saw, we cannot replace or compensate for the lack of governmental intervention. We don't have that number of forces.
Well, one of the critiques I've seen of the UNMISS mandate is that you are both supposed to work with the government and support the government, but you're also supposed to operate as a bit of a watchdog of the government. And you can see that there might be a tension there in doing both those things simultaneously. Is that a tension that you feel? And if so, how do you balance those responsibilities?
I think it's a tension that is in all mandates of peacekeeping missions. I mean, all of them, I see some former colleagues here, all of them have that ambiguity in their mandates. They're virtually all, maybe not UNMISS, but the normal peacekeeping missions do have a mandate to strengthen government capacity in a number of areas. And at the same time, you very often have a monitoring and reporting mandate on human rights, on other issues. And that tension we're living with every day. And it's not an easy job, but it's not an easy job in any of the countries where there are peacekeeping operations with these types of mandates. Of course, it's happening both on the human rights side, but it's also happening in other areas. And one needs to navigate that territory quite carefully. But I think the main way for me to address this is never give anyone an uncomfortable surprise. So if you inform the president, inform ministers about what you're going to say, firstly, give them the chance to fix whatever they need to fix. If they haven't succeeded in fixing it, you say that I'm going to make a statement about this because that's my mandate. But you tell them, they know what's coming. Then you go public after that. If you give people surprises all the time, where they haven't had a chance even to fix what you think is fixable, and where you see weaknesses, then I think the tensions increase. So it's about being fair, honest, and open, and give them a chance first, and also tell them ahead of time so that they are aware.
Yeah. Given the tremendous challenges that we've seen, what are the things that you most need in terms of doing what you're trying to do better? You just came from New York. I'm sure you're talking to people up there about whether it's air assets or more political support. What do you prioritize in terms of the requests for being able to operate more effectively?
I wish I was running this mission in a different fiscal environment than we have at the moment. As you've seen, there are huge resource challenges, not least on the force generation side. But there are limits as to what you can ask for these days. So what we're trying to do, there's is 3 important things. One, we have a 3-year plan in our budget. We've been very modest and realistic in our budget planning process. We're asking for an increase every year according to our absorptive capacity. Last year, we spent 99.8% of our budget. We're really running a very effective operation. So we're asking for an increase building on where we were last year and in accordance with the plan. And I'm appealing to them to give us the money we're asking for. And I'm also explaining to member states that really not doing that will be putting us in a situation where we just cannot implement our mandate. We have constraints already, as I've shown you. Now, to ask for more military assets, the environment is very tough at this point in time. The riverine capability we're asking for, but that is a multi-purpose riverine capability. That is for all components of the mission to use the same types of boats. So it's, again, a multi-purpose, multifunctional arrangement. It's not asking for a major military contribution. It's civilian, commercially contracted boats that can be used for military purposes. And then I think, in an environment where there is expectations around Mali, around extra resources for DRC and M23 operations, there is potentially something coming along the lines on Somalia. We have a big challenge at the moment. And so my very strong message is, give us what we ask for. We need it. It is exactly in accordance with where we said we would be 3 years ago. And then I think, I hope the environment will change somewhat within a year or two so that we are in a position to see what more we can do, in particular on the force side. It is needed. And I think that is my response to that question, at least if we're going to implement the POC mandate in the way that is expected from us.
I want to move beyond the POC for a moment now, and we'll probably come back to it in some of the later questions, but just to talk about some of the things that have been happening in South Sudan that are concerning, I think, for those of us who are watching closely. Some of the harassment, even murder of journalists, harassment of civil society representatives. It's a trajectory that I think a lot of us find concerning and is not living up to some of the expectations, even if they were too high before independence. As someone who's followed this for so long through the CPA before that, how do you make sense of this? And what do you say in response to some of these very worrying signs?
Clearly, there's concerns about what's happening. I have made quite a number of public statements about this lately, both on the killing of Isaiah Ibrahim. It was one incident, but also on several incidences that have happened, including our own staff. There's an ambiguous development here. On the one hand, when you raise these questions and these issues very strongly to the highest levels of government, there's a very clear message that this, we strongly, we're very concerned, we find it unacceptable that these things happen, and there's a very strong agreement to what you're saying. And there's promises that we're going to do our utmost to get investigations completed, to get those culprits brought to the books, etc., etc. At the same time, things are still happening, and so it's a very challenging environment in the sense that, on the one hand, those that really decide these things are actually making very strong statements that this should never happen in our country. This is not what we fought for, and at the same time, there is still stuff happening. And so I think we need to see stronger accountability so that the processes that have been put in place in terms of investigations are completed and that people are brought to the books. That's what we expect, both on the Isaiah Ibrahim case, but also on other cases. And I think in these cases, typically, again, we need to do two things. We need to support the capacity of the government to both strengthen its own human rights institutions so that they can investigate and they can do more. We need to strengthen the capacity of the security institutions so that they can investigate and be able to complete those investigations so that people can be held to account. And at the same time, it is my obligation as head of mission to report on what we see and to monitor the developments and report to the Security Council. Hence, we also have to address this in public and in the SG's reports. And of course, this is coming up now in the Security Council meeting on the 21st of March, which is when the next report will be discussed. And so we need to do several things at the same time. Only criticizing doesn't help. Only supporting the capacity building but not addressing the reporting obligations is also not in accordance with the mandate. So we're trying to move on several fronts at the same time. I think we also need to do what we can to have a number of other actors engaged so that it's not only the mission, but it is a number of both national and international partners that need to be part of a process to try to get over this and bring the trend in a more positive direction.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask one more question. Just before I do, let me invite people to start lining up at the 2 microphones here, because after this we'll go to some questions with the audience. So anybody who's interested in a question, please go to one of the microphones. Also, I believe our viewers on the webcast are able to submit questions as well, and those will make their way up here. So my final question, there are, I think, 2 processes in South Sudan that are happening or about to happen that are very critical for them. One being the process of writing the new permanent constitution, and that process was just recently extended to last 2 additional years. The other one, a reconciliation process, and this is a bit nascent, and I think it's still trying to figure out how exactly it's going to operate. What is UNMISS doing to support these 2 processes, and what advice do you in particular have in order to make these processes effective and not to miss the opportunity that these 2 processes present?
These 2 processes are also extremely important together because some of the critical issues that have been feeding tensions in the country can also be fed in to the constitutional process and potentially be resolved. So there's also a cross-fertilization between the 2 processes, and it's important to see them as linked. And that means that you need time. So the fact that the constitutional review process now has been extended to December 2014 gives more time for that process to take place and to take on board many more of the complex issues that need to be discussed broadly in South Sudan, but also not least broad consultations at all levels, including at the county level, the state level, bringing in all sorts of forces, political forces and civil society, church groups, whatever. It can become much more inclusive. So that's very positive. Now, how are we supporting it? UNMISS is leading the international coordination on the support for the constitutional review process. We both have a principals meeting at my level, but we have technical support committee as well. And then there's clusters in all the areas relevant to taking this constitutional review process forward, where the different partners, be it national, international, are providing support in, or have offered support in different areas. Since the process hasn't really moved forward very actively up to now, and we hope this now will shift and change, all the ducks are lined up to support the process on a number of fronts. It's a significant effort that is going to be made by the international community to support this process, which is critical for the future of the country. On the reconciliation side, it's still very nascent, as you said. It's an initiative that has been taken first by the Vice President, endorsed by the Council of Ministers, but it's still under formation. And what my advice has been to the government and to government, the leadership, is to make sure that the design of it is discussed between all the key stakeholders, and so that there is an agreement amongst all of them on how to take the process forward. So that discussion is yet to happen in a very deep way. There's lots of meetings now, but they're primarily, for example, on the SPLM convention issues. They're primarily on the party, the reform of the party, and the leadership has focused more on that. So that's a little further down the road. So we'll see exactly how this pans out. There's a conference that is being organized for mid-April, if it goes, or 19, 20, 21 April, if it goes ahead on time. That's more likely, I think, to kickstart a broader process, and there needs to be some agreement in the context of that conference on exactly what the design will look like, the structure, taking this whole process forward, the timelines, etc. All of that is yet to be totally agreed.
Right. I can't believe there aren't any questions in the audience. Yeah, please, but I need you to come up to the microphone and ask your question, please. So please introduce yourself and try to keep questions short.
Thank you so much. My name is Jamal from the Embassy of Sudan. I believe I would like to thank Her Excellency Hilde Johnson for this presentation. I think her expertise in Sudan is unchallengeable since she is in the region for quite enough time. So my question that last week there was a report by the UN showing that there is a base for the justice and equality movement in South Sudan, and that's a rebel troop that's fighting the government in the north. And is it the only one base that you found out the whole South Sudan? And to what extent you feel or you think that might pose a threat to the community in South Sudan and the whole region, and to what extent it might hinder the ongoing negotiations between the two parties in Addis Ababa? And what is the reaction of the UN on this? Just reporting, or is there going to be some action taken by the Security Council in the next meeting? The second question is that the relationship between the UN personnel and the South Sudan government in a way of protection the UN personnel in South Sudan. I'm asking this because there was a report, or there were reports last 4 months or so that one of your assistants were threatened to be killed. His name is Ted Dagny, and he was obliged to leave the country from South Sudan. So is that something, is it true? And what is your reaction on this? Thank you so much.
You want to take those two, or you want to take another one?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see more hands, but maybe you took all the questions. Let's see. Jamal, on the issue of the GEM presence, I think that was the panel of experts of the United Nations. It was not UNMISS. I have yet to read their report. I don't know the details, but I understand that something came out from the panel of experts. From UNMISS's side, we don't have evidence or any verification to the effect that there are bases in the territory of South Sudan. We have access in most areas, but in some areas it is impeded. But we don't have that type of evidence. So in terms of impacts on Addis negotiations, this is much more the mandate of Special Envoy Haile Menkerios and the team that is supporting the AUHIP. So I'm not the right person to respond to your question, but I think generally I would say the following, that that is what the JBVMM is for, the Joint Border Monitoring and Verification Mechanism. It is exactly to verify these types of claims and reports, and it is to report to them, to the two parties and to the Council. And so basically the JBVMM's purpose is to verify this. So the sooner the JBVM can be established, the zone, the demilitarized border zone be established, the more knowledge and certainty we can get on this. So I think any delays on this will also delay the verification of whatever happens on both sides of the border. And so that's really, really critical. So I hope now it's not even about negotiations, it's about implementing the agreed arrangements for JBVMM and just DZBZ.
It's a lot of acronyms.
I get lost in that one. On the issue of the advisor, no, this is not correct. No threats of that had been issued against him. However, we've had a couple of incidents, one expulsion of one staff member, and two were held for hours and interrogations a few weeks back, but that was on two human rights staff members. The report you've heard is not correct, but we have had issues with a few of our staff, and we have raised it at the highest levels and received reassurances it's not going to happen again. So apologies have been extended to us from all the concerned authorities.
Mm-hmm. Let's go here.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Paulette Lee. I'm on the board of Voices for Sudan, a DC-based advocacy organization. Thank you for your remarks, but I have to confess I'm not clear where the threat to the civilians is coming from. I heard you mention the SPLA was turning against its own people. But basically, are these threats from Sudan, cross-border incursions, or what is the threat? Thank you.
Take one more over here and put them together.
Madam Johnson, thank you for your remarks. Michael Boyce from the Partnership for Effective Peacekeeping. And you obviously have a very robust protection of civilians strategy that requires requires your troop contingents to carry out many different tasks. I wonder if you find that the troop contingents that you are getting are sufficiently trained and equipped and capable to carry out those tasks when they arrive at the mission, or to what extent you would like the Secretariat or member states to perhaps be doing more to make sure that those troops are ready when they hit the ground to carry out the tasks that you need them to do. Thank you.
You want to take those two?
Yeah. I didn't say that the SPLA was turning against its people, so please, for any journalist, do not quote me like that. I was saying that this is one of the risks and the dilemmas and challenges we can face. It happened in civilian disarmament that violations were happening, and there is a challenge when there is a full military operation on the way, if it indeed is going off in a few days or a week or two, that this can happen. And it's not a deliberate move. It is what we can say can happen within disciplined elements. So those are the risks that we have. Where does the threat come from? Well, it is basically a combination of armed groups and a combination also of escalated cycles of violence that get out of hand. I mean, it's the two of them. And that is intercommunal, but often also fueled with weaponry and arms. So you see a situation where either a combination of the two happen, or that it's basically an armed group active in a few areas. I didn't go through that in detail, but in the unity state, it's the SSLA groups that are active, sometimes less active, sometimes more active, depending on the situation. In the Upper Nile state, it's the Shilluk-based militia groups. And in Jonglei state, it is primarily David Yahya. So those are the three types of different armed groups that are active. And then in addition to that, you have these cycles of violence that are intercommunally based, but also can be fueled by political forces and other forces. On the troop contingents that we receive, we can always have even better, both equipped and competent forces. But my experience and our experience with the contingents we have is that they are solid. They're willing to go out in the field. They're patrolling. We don't face a resistance against doing the job. They are basically strong in moving out, and they are taking our instructions. So my experience is that with the contingents we have in South Sudan, we have a composition where there isn't resistance against doing the job on the ground to protect civilians, including physical protection. On equipment, there are some issues because some are equipped, for example, with very heavy equipment that takes much longer to get out to the field, etc. And of course, that's issues that we need to deal with in New York with the post-generation process. This is an environment which is difficult and where not everything is easy to take on helicopters, etc. So some of those challenges we are faced with, but they're not major impediments, but they are bumps in the road that we have to deal with.
Yeah. Let's take a couple questions over here, please.
I think we'll take 3 or 4 so I can do
okay.
quickly.
Hi, I'm Deeksha Sharma, and I work at the State Department, and I have 2 quick questions for you. Could you, in more detail, explain how the warning system works? And in the presentation, your success story that you were speaking about, how was the group able to turn around? And also, could you give me an assessment of what you think the state of civil society is in South Sudan right now? Thank you.
Jerry.
Thank you. Jerry Hyman at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. You said you're going to ask for more resources for the coming period. I wonder if someone were to respond, one of the member states were to respond, well, three questions to you. First, since the interim period, now we have a period of independence and sovereignty. How long do you think UNMISS will need to be around? And number two, what conditions, if any, would you put on that for the government of South Sudan? And number three, what would you say if the government does not meet those conditions?
Is that enough? You want one more?
No, I can take more.
Okay, let's finish up here.
Rick Houghton from the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of Sudan. I would be interested in your observation of how effective religious leaders are in peacemaking and mediation, and how that might be improved.
Okay.
Take those.
Firstly, on the early warning, I mean, we've had several incidences which have been successful in averting that seeming and kind of boiling tensions have prevented from erupting into violence. So that has happened several times. But the biggest one was this example of 6,000 to 7,000. This was engagement by the county commissioner, the community leaders, supported by our team. And basically, it was a matter of convincing the leaders of the column. They had inspiration from a profit arrangement, and it was that, I think, factor that led them to mobilize. However, communication, I think, took place that convinced them that that wasn't going to happen, and they then turned around. So, I mean, it wasn't us only, but it was us facilitating their ability to meet the group, and for us also through our civil affairs to engage with the authorities and with the community leaders. On civil society in South Sudan is quite weak in the sense that they need also stronger capacity and a stronger voice. But there is a number of organizations, but the membership is small, their resources are meager, and there's also limited support for developing, real civil society networks that can that again engage in political issues, etc. So it's still very nascent and needs a lot of strengthening. Now to the issues about exit of UNMISS that I think Jerry Harman was raising. I want to just refer to the benchmarks that have been agreed by the Security Council and by us and the government, which is benchmarks, 5 of them, and per benchmark you have indicators. Those indicators are being assessed periodically against green, yellow, and red lights. And of course, the closer you get to green lights on the most of the indicators, the closer you get to a positive development in South Sudan and a movement towards exit. Now, what we are seeing in other peacekeeping missions is when you move to a consolidation phase, which has yet to happen in South Sudan, you change the indicators somewhat according to and adapted to the situation. When you move to an exit phase, you change the indicators further. So what is not possible for me to say now is at which point in time will South Sudan reach a stage where we move through consolidation to exit and where virtually all the indicators have reached the stage of being green. Now there's a mix of green, yellow, and red. In the indicators, we're going to share the new benchmark assessments with the Security Council on the 21st of March. And so basically, it's a systematic assessment that is taking place against benchmarks that are in accordance with the mandate, against the indicators. And it's only when we see that there is at least an overall positive assessment of the different indicators that we can see the mission move out and we move to the exit stage. But as a ballpark, East Timor, UNMIT is now leaving, has basically packed up virtually. And that happened with the same kind of process, and that took 10, 12 years. In South Sudan, we don't know whether it would be more or less, whatever, but it also is very much related to the performance of the government and to the ability of the government to deliver against those indicators. So that will be the test for the country, and that's what I'm telling them is if you want us out of here quickly, you perform well, get as much greens as you can, and then we'll move out. But if that doesn't happen, then of course there will be a more likelihood of a longer presence in the country.
And there was a religious leaders question.
Yeah. The church leaders in South Sudan, the religious leaders, have played extremely important and good roles during the civil war. They were the glue that held South Sudan together during the civil war. They managed to reconcile communities when things became difficult, and they managed to run processes that actually effectively kept a nascent kind of stability in South Sudan, even under the worst circumstances. Of course, the situation is somewhat different now. We're in an independent country, but still, my opinion is the church is still the best you have in terms of reconciliation with competency among both church leaders and others on how to reconcile communities. But of course, the violence that we're seeing and some of the challenges we're faced with are also getting deeply political. And we also see that there's a linkage between intercommunal violence and political power play. And so therefore we're getting into an environment where the churches can do and continue to do more. However, we might also need to see in a political engagement in some cases that addresses some of the what should I say, the incentives for reaching agreement and holding and implementing the agreement.
Mm-hmm. We have several questions from the online audience. I'm going to read one of them, and then we'll go to several over here. This is a question from Taj Al-Khazin. His question is, what is the potential for UNMISS to mediate between the government of South Sudan and David Yao Yao as he has requested? So it's a good question. Let's take a few more over here.
Thanks, John. My name is Steve Hilber. I work in the Office of International Justice and Peace at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. I want to sort of follow up the question that our Episcopal Church friend gave is, could you give us an example of a success that the churches have had? We know that Catholic Relief Services and some of the other groups work on this. It would be interesting to hear some of the, one success story. And can you drill a little bit deeper as well into the cattle raiding and how either the church groups, civil society groups could help, prevent that kind of thing? I know it's a deep societal thing, but it's going to take a long time to resolve. But how you go about doing that? Thanks. Thanks, John. And actually, thanks for all the work you do for the South Sudanese.
Take one more.
Hi, I'm Samantha Chu, a research analyst at D3 Systems. In the beginning of your talk, you talked about decentralization and how that's important. And I'm seeing that with these transportation problems and access to resources, formal decentralization policy may be key. Do you think, if you agree, what would this look like? Would it be top-down? And if so, do you think the government is strong enough to be able to support formal decentralization policies? Would it be political, fiscal, or administrative? And would there be enough resources at the decentralized level to be able to support these foreign policies? Thank you.
Take all those?
Yeah, that's okay. Well, on the first one, we will do what the government is requesting us to do, and we are in a situation where, of course, a UN engagement with any militia group runs two risks. One risk, of course, is that you up the price because you become there's a prominent actor involved. And so you up the price, and you then risk that what comes as requests on the table become very expensive, quote unquote, in political terms. The other risk, of course, is political legitimization. And those two factors need to be catered for in a discussion about any UN role in any of these types of reintegration negotiations. And of course, this is ultimately also a choice the government has to make, what they think is the right way to run a reintegration negotiation process. Secondly, on the success stories of the faith-based and the church's engagement for peace, yes, I can mention two. The Acholi-Mahdi conflict in eastern Equatoria was about to get out of hand in 2011. We engaged from our side, supported the church leaders' engagement, and they worked with the county commissioners, the local authorities, with blessing from the governor. And this was in the end taken over entirely by the Catholic Church and the bishop, and they ran the process. And although it's not entirely resolved in the sense that there's still, tension between the communities, there is no conflict. There is an agreed arrangement, and it is being implemented. So that's one that I would mention. There's another where we engaged at the where we engaged at the request of Bishop Parida Tarban, who many of you might know, where the situation between the Taposa and the Ye was getting out of hand, again in eastern Equatoria, and where we were asked by Bishop Parida, he just called us and said, please, we need to fly in as quickly as possible, because if this now gets out of hand, it can be really explosive. So we managed through our helicopters to get him and a few other key leaders from the church side and local authorities to meet community chiefs, and they managed to avert a very explosive situation. So we have several of those incidences, which are not like big headline, but they could have ended up becoming really big. And so, of course, the Jonglei peace process is one, but it's still now volatile. And in my view, the Archbishop didn't get enough time to run the process that would make the peace process rooted enough and that would ensure implementation. And this whole implementation matrix from the Jonglei peace process really never was really implemented. And that's the challenge, that when agreements have been signed by all parties, there needs to be follow-up mechanisms so that all the different parties actually do implement what has been agreed. And that's even part of the peace process. I think the failure that we make, whether it's in international global peace negotiations or it is internally in South Sudan, is people think the job is done when something is signed on paper. That's when the job starts. A peace process is an everyday job, and it starts with implementing the agreement you've signed. That's when the peace process starts. It doesn't start at the negotiation table when you reach something on paper. It is through implementing word by word what you have agreed and making sure the process moves forward. That's the peace process. And that's the misunderstanding that we have. Everybody breathes with ease, as they did with the CPA, with my brother from Sudan here also. We breathe with ease, like, oh, the CPA has been signed, fantastic. But it is when the agreement is to be implemented, the peace process, the real peace process goes, because what is the most costly and most difficult and most challenging thing is to implement compromises. Reaching compromises at the table is really hard. Implementing them is much, much worse, because that costs something. Writing something on paper doesn't cost anything. Implementing what is on paper is what costs something, and it's painful. So then we just let people go on with it totally without support very often, and that's the mistake we're making. So we need to understand that we need to support these processes even more strongly after the agreement has been signed, because that's the toughest job. Then on cattle raiding, this is one of the biggest dilemmas we have, because this is an old tradition among pastoralist communities all over the world, and in South Sudan, that has permeated into something else through two things. One, through accessibility of advanced weapons, which has changed totally the equation. And two, through change of value sets and principles that before guided these processes. And when I'm saying that is that the civil war and everything that has happened in South Sudan, what was before the guiding principles for any cattle raid: you always protect women and children. You never, ever attack any of them. You don't abduct them. You protect them. And this is going on between the young guys from both communities. Those values and principles of the old cattle raids have gone. And then you have the advanced weaponry in addition. And they permeate into something really massive, and the cycles of violence become much, much worse than they ever were in the past. And then you also have the temptation by some to feed in to the communities incentives to continue this for political purposes, for other reasons. So you have driving forces behind this that makes it even worse. So these are among the issues that, if it were the old cattle raids, we would have had a better chance at getting control of this. With what's happening now, it's permeating into cycles of violence that have much, much larger proportions than what happened in the past. And I don't have any easy answer on how it can be stopped, except that we probably need to look at the incentives. If one can address the incentives and try to turn that around, then probably we'll be having a better chance at stopping it. On decentralization, I was presenting the decentralization of the mission as it is, because we need to reach the population in the different parts of the country. As for decentralization of South Sudanese government, that's a different story. Now, they have in the transitional constitution a commitment to decentralization. However, the resources that go with that delegation of authority are not being adequately transferred, so we're not seeing a real empowerment of the rural areas as yet. And of course, with fiscal austerity at this point in time, it's even harder for states and counties to be able to assert the authority they are entitled to within the transitional constitution. Now, there will be a debate, I'm sure, about it when the constitutional review process gets going on federalism, not federalism, what type of decentralization, what structure, what's the role of the governors, etc., etc. And that debate we leave very, very generously to the South Sudanese to take on. And if they want to have, any support in terms of technical advice on which options, pros and cons, we're happy to provide it. But we don't give advice on the choices they make.
Okay, we have two people who've been waiting a long time here, so we're going to go to you too, but I know you have to go right at 11:30, so I need to ask you both to be very brief and just one question, please.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Hilde, for a great role that the UN doing in South Sudan. My name is Jon Temin. One of the questions is, there is a refugee came from Nuba Mountain and from Blue Nile to South Sudan in Unity State and in Afanali State. But we hear it that the Sudan government is still bombard those areas and those camps. What the United Nations do to South Sudan from bombarding those refugees?
Take the other one.
Ms. Johnson, in your previous activities, you were very involved in the CPA. I read your book, and you seem to have some back channel between John Garang, Dr. Ghazi, Taha, and so forth. The question I wanted to ask you is, there was an obsession, I thought, from the West, that there had to be a division of the two Sudans. I was not for that. And I think we're seeing some of the problems that in the CPA, there was not an actual understanding of what it needs to create a sovereign nation state. And I advocated at the time, with no success to people in the SPLM and to Khartoum, that without a policy of economic development for the people, this was going to be a problem. And isn't it the case that we're suffering today in South Sudan? You can't have a country stipulated by law that does not actually include in it the basis for stability of its people. Cattle raiding, fighting over land, fighting over water. These conflicts in Africa come from a lack of economic development, from infrastructure. And isn't that one of the problems of the CPA itself, that it failed to do this?
I'm getting a few signals that you need to go, so.
Yeah. I'll be brief. On the first question, there hasn't been, to our knowledge, and we have not verified, any recent bombardments of the refugee camps, Yida, Maban. The latest that I am familiar with was the one we verified in November 2011. So there has been reported bombardments, but not on these locations and in these areas. Secondly, the question on the CPA, I would be very firm in saying the CPA did not in any way set out a strategy of two Sudans. The CPA granted the referendum and the right of the South Sudanese people to take their own decision as to whether to belong in a united Sudan or whether to have their own country. Without that referendum, there would be no peace between the two parties. The civil war would have continued. And so it's a choice between allowing that referendum, permitting it, and then the consequence, of course, was the result of that referendum led to something, but that was not in any way forecasted in the CPA. Now, all the issues that we have discussed here and that were are part of the makeup of South Sudan. They were there before. There's nothing new that I have said. The same cattle raids went on within the same types of armament and the same issues. The difference now is that this is now a new and independent country, and our eyes are on South Sudan domestically in a different way than what was the case under the Civil War. Is it worse or better? I would not be in a position to say. It is up to the South Sudanese leadership to prove that the decisions that they made and advocated for is actually a decision that they will be able to defend and justify through delivering leadership that can resolve some of those problems. And that's what we're here to try to support, so that we can see a much more positive development in South Sudan than happened decades ago, including the past few years. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Just before we conclude, I need to ask a favor of the audience. I need to ask to please stay seated so the SRSG can leave, because she's due across the street basically now. So if you just hold your breath for just a few minutes. Thank you very much for coming. You got a super busy schedule. Really appreciate you spending this time with us, and thank you all for coming as well.